So good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kristyn DiDominck, and I'm the Executive Director of the Bucks-Mont Collaborative. We are a nonprofit membership organization that's focused on collaboration, primarily in the health and human services sector in Bucks and Montgomery counties. So we seek to strengthen nonprofits in our community through information and resource sharing, through education and training, and community conversations and action on timely issues and needs like this one that we're having today. So we are so thankful to gather together to hear your ideas and your needs regarding our regional rail system. So thank you to the SEPTA 4 team for joining us today for this presentation and the time to listen and connect. And before we hear from them, I'd like to introduce our co-hosts for this discussion, the Partnership TMA of Montgomery County and TMA Bucks, who will share a little bit more about their organizations and what reimagining regional rail could mean for our community. So first, I'd like to welcome Jacqui Baxter, the Executive Director of Partnership TMA of Montgomery County.
Thanks, Kristyn. Hello, everybody. Partnership TMA stands for Transportation Management Association. We collaborate with more than 150 public and private partners, and our mission is to enhance and expand transportation options, ease traffic congestion, and educate and engage our local communities on issues of land use, the environment, and healthy lifestyles. We're very excited to be here with you today because within Montgomery County, we have more than 40 train stations and 7 regional rail lines. And in addition to serving Center City, many of us use those lines to access downtowns within Montco. So thanks very much, Kristyn. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Steve in TMA Bucks.
Thanks, Jacqui. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Knoll, not Ashley Soulon as the screen dictates, but guess whose link I used to log on today. I'm the Executive Director of TMA Bucks. We are the nonprofit TMA serving all of Bucks County. And I want to extend my thanks to Kristyn from the Bucks-Mont Collaborative, also to Jacqui from Partnership TMA for including us in today's session. We work every day on a variety of transportation-related issues and matters across Bucks County, including improving public transit access, reducing traffic congestion, and the vehicle tailpipe emissions that come with it, assisting individuals with using public transportation to get to jobs in Bucks County, and traffic safety-related activities and education, just to name a few. So if you're on the Bucks County side of County Line Road, and certainly if you're on the Montgomery County side, I'd encourage you to take a look at the Partnership TMA and send your business Jacqui's way and your memberships. And of course, we're membership supported over here in Bucks County and would love to have you join us as well. You can find more on our website, which is tmabucks.com. And thanks to everybody for participating in today's session.
Thanks so much, Steve. So we are thrilled to welcome SEPTA forward and to hear a little bit more from them. Just to kind of give an overview of what we're going to be doing today, we'll have a presentation by the SEPTA 4 team, and then we'll probably around like 12:30 or so, depending on how things flow, we'll move into breakout sessions so that we can continue the conversation and hear directly about challenges and needs and what rail service should be. So I'm going to hand it over to Ryan Judge with the SEPTA 4 team to kick us off. So thanks, Ryan, for being here.
Thanks, Kristyn. So I'm Ryan Judge. I'm the Director of Strategic Planning and Analysis here at SEPTA, and we have a couple colleagues on the line who will walk us through some of the further discussions as we move along. So we have Claudia Leaf, Will Herzog, and Jenna Fortunati, who are all planning analysts here at SEPTA on a variety of projects. But in the interest of time, I think we'll jump right into the slides here and get started. We have a good number of slides to get through and some exciting content. But the work that we're really focused on in the planning department here at SEPTA and at SEPTA in general is a part of our strategic plan, which we refer to as SEPTA Forward. And really what that document does for us is it lays out a framework for how we're addressing the challenges we face. We know, and I think everyone's well aware of the types of challenges that many agencies like SEPTA, transit agencies, transportation agencies, or public agencies in general have faced since the beginning of the pandemic. And what SEPTA Forward does for us is identifies those challenges and lays out a vision for where we're going and a set of strategies and goals for how we're going to get there. And this was built off of feedback that we've received from internal employees. We have about 10,000 minds here that are working together to accomplish our goals. And then, of course, the the information we get from our customers day in and day out, and of course our regional stakeholders from across the region. So SEPTA Forward is really our framework for decision making and prioritizing what we're spending our time and our investments on at this point in time. And we know that's really important because we're adapting to what we refer to as a changing landscape, where the way that people move and live and work has just changed drastically in the past 2 years. And it was changing before that in the decade or so leading up to it, but we saw an acceleration of a lot of trends. And this is probably best exemplified by things like work from home, or even the experience changes that people have and the expectations that customers have and when they use transit. And I think Uber and Lyft are a really good example of that. Uber and Lyft are really nothing more than a fancy app for a taxi, but they've completely changed the way that people plan their trips and pay for their trips. And for us, what that means is we have to change the way that people pay and plan for transit as well. And the best analogy to think about it that way is Uber and Lyft are ubiquitous. If you go to Chicago or you go to London or New York or Tokyo, the Uber app is the same anywhere you go. Transit doesn't have that same benefit. So for us, we have to make sure that our services are really easy to use, easy to plan, and easy to pay for, so that we're attracting as many new riders and trips as we can possibly. So that's the best way that we'll be able to serve our region. So we've taken all of that and we've established what our vision is for the future, which is really a recognition that SEPTA is more than transit. It's the way that we connect to each other. And I think that this is really important for us as a mission-driven and mission-oriented agency, because our job isn't just to move a bus from point A to point B. It's about moving people from one place to another so that they can visit their grandchildren or get to that job interview or go to school or do whatever it is. It's about the people on both sides of those trips. And that's ultimately why we exist as an organization. It's not just about moving buses or trains around. So we have a series of goals that are helping us achieve that vision. It's a pretty lofty vision, but we're proud of it. And the three goals that we have that are helping us work towards that are to develop a proactive organization. We can't sit around and wait for things to happen the way we want them to happen. We have to change the course of transit in our region. The second is to provide an intuitive experience. I mentioned that Uber and Lyft experience being consistent and ubiquitous across other cities. So us providing an intuitive experience is really a critical part of us making sure that our services are easy to use and attractive for people across the region, visitors and residents alike. And then the third goal is making sure that all of our services are working together and consistent and provide a seamless transit network for everyone, whether it's bus, subway, regional rail, light rail, or anything in between. But ultimately, SEPTA is the first choice, regardless of mode. So we've had a number of focus points over the past year or so since we adopted this strategic plan that are helping us achieve what we're referring to as a lifestyle transit network. And there's three main components of that. One is that we're unifying all of our route transit services. That's our subways and our trolleys and things like the Norristown Speed Line, making sure that all of those services are branded and talked about together so that they're easy to use. The second is our bus network redesign, or we lovingly call it Bus Revolution now. This group had a similar briefing on a couple of months ago, which is looking at all of our bus network and bus routes to make sure that they're serving the purposes that we need them to today. A lot of the bus routes we have haven't changed in the past 60 or 70 years when we started to take them over, even though the way that people get around, the land use around these routes have really changed substantially. And then the third element is the regional rail master plan, or reimagining regional rail as we talk about it now. And then we'll talk a lot more in detail about what that means. But together, these three initiatives are helping make sure that our services are adapting to the way that people need them in 2022 and beyond. So that we're adapting to a future that's beneficial to our region and addresses the challenges that we face. For the purpose of this group, we did pull some basic information for Montgomery County and Bucks County specifically, so that we can give a little bit of an overview of what we see in these regions in particular. And I think as was mentioned earlier, these two counties have a substantial amount of transit service across the region, particularly with regional rail service. Montgomery County has about 6 regional rail lines. There's more than 48,000 people who are taking transit pre-pandemic across those regional rail lines and a variety of bus routes that serve that region as well. And beyond the ridership that we see, SEPTA provides a benefit to Montgomery County in terms of the economic value that it provides to the region, the housing value that it supports, and of course the jobs that we provide and support access to jobs across the region, and directly support about 3,400 jobs in Montgomery County. When you look at Bucks County, it's a similar story, slightly different numbers. There's 4 regional rail lines and a little over a dozen bus routes that serve that region, including the Lansdale-Doylestown line, Trenton line, Warminster, and West Trenton lines that moved almost 13,000 people every day before the pandemic. And there's similar sorts of economic impacts across that region, almost $300 million in economic impact and an average annual value and over 2,000 jobs. So we know that our value is much more than just the trip that we provide. It's the experiences we provide. It's the economic vitality that we support. This is a region like us where, you know, we're generally historically developed. The types of patterns that we see in development patterns we see just aren't possible without transit. And that's particularly true in the Northeast corridor. So we want to spend the bulk of our time here focusing on the Regional Rail Master Plan. And that's because it's a critical part of that SEPTA Forward initiative and that to build towards a lifestyle transit network. But we usually start this conversation off with a little bit of why we're approaching the project the way we're approaching it and a little bit of the legacy that we're working to address. And I'm sure some of this will be very familiar to a few of the people on the call. I see some familiar names who have heard a variation of this presentation before, but I appreciate your interest in this as well. So, you know, some history that I think is pretty familiar for most people. About a century ago, there's two different railroads, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Reading Railroad, and they built electric commuter rail systems that served our region. They had small towns develop around their stations. They took people into the city and out of the city. And they served our populations in our region very well for a time period. And then in the 80s, SEPTA and the city of Philadelphia worked to create a connection between those two routes. The Pennsylvania Railroad and the Reading Railroad were eventually taken over by SEPTA. We worked to physically connect these two networks together. And what it's created is the only example in North America of a fully electrified through running system, which means that trains from one side of the system go through Center City and come out another system, and they're using fully electric trains. There's no diesel. There's very limited track with freight that we share. And this is a huge asset for us. It's incredibly rare. It's the type of thing that if you look at Boston, they're talking about spending several $1 billion to connect their two stub end terminals in downtown Boston. And it's something that the city of Philadelphia, the region of southeastern Pennsylvania, already has in place. So it's an incredible legacy to build on. And ultimately, because of that and a few other elements, we have the best regional rail infrastructure in North America. And we've tested this against our peers. I know it's a pretty bold statement, but we have compared us to Boston, to Chicago, to Long Island Railroad, and Metro North, and a few other examples. But ultimately, because of the lack of overlap we have with freight railroads, because of the amount of double track that we have in many areas, because of the fact that we're fully electrified, we have this incredible infrastructure compared to our peers. And it's frankly a bit of an envy of our peers. So we're looking at international peers to figure out best examples and best practices for how we can operate this today. We know before COVID, over 130,000 people rode regional rail every day. And ultimately, it was because it made their lives better. And we'll give a few examples of that. Somebody who lived in Paoli but worked in Center City could save 20 minutes because they didn't have to sit in traffic on the Schuylkill Expressway. They could just hop on the train. There's a student up at Del Valle University who can go to a concert at the Kimmel Center and they don't have to own a car because they can hop on the train from that point. But we also know that it leaves some people behind, that it doesn't serve everybody as well as it could at this point in time. And there's an office worker who lives in Tacony. They might take the 56 bus because they can't afford the cost of regional rail because it's priced at a premium right now. Because there's not a good path from somebody's office to Exton train station, they may drive from South Philly out to their office directly instead of taking the Paoli phone down. It doesn't provide those connections. And then there's a student at Penn Med who takes the trolley, even though regional rail would get them closer to where they want to go, because that trolley comes more frequently throughout the day. So they might walk a little bit farther, but get a more frequent trip out of it. And then in Mount Airy, a resident who may take the 23 bus because they can't get their wheelchair on a regional rail train right now and get into Center City. So they're taking a longer bus ride because that's the only accessible option. And the question that we're trying to answer with this project is ultimately, can regional rail work for them as well? And with SEPTA Forward, we made a pretty bold statement, not only that it could work for them, but that it has to work for them. It has to work for everyone across our region as a part of this one lifestyle transit network. So this master plan effort, which we're calling Reimagining Regional Rail, is laying out a vision for what that looks like, of how we can make regional rail more useful to more people. Because ultimately, this incredible asset for our region has to work for everybody so we're getting the best value out of it. So we have a hypothesis, and that's really how we're approaching this project, is that ultimately, if regional rail operates more frequently, both ways all day, is better connected to local transit, is integrated with the fares for local transit, and is more accessible and easier to understand, then it will be more useful to more riders, that it will make existing trips better, that it will increase access for everybody across the region, and will create a more equitable transit network for everyone that benefits the entirety of our region. So what we're looking at now is, one, is the demand there to justify that sort of investment? And two, can we provide that service? What sort of infrastructure investments or operation needs would we need to adjust so that we can actually provide the service that our region needs and desires for the future? So we're working through three main phases right now. Phase one is understanding the system, which is really a fancy way of saying existing conditions. What's going on now? How do people feel about it? Where do we see opportunity for improving moving forward? The second phase, which is what we're starting to turn our attention to now as we wrap up phase one, is developing a series of scenarios that are looking at what the possibilities are in the future and what the pros and cons and trade-offs are of various approaches. And then the third phase is ultimately taking all the feedback that we get, taking all the consideration of those trade-offs and identifying a clear vision for where we're headed so that our priorities are aligned to that and we're marching towards a common goal for our region. So we've been working through phase one over the past couple months, and we're starting to hear a lot about the system, about what people see, what people think about the system, and what works today. We'll walk through a little bit of the existing conditions as we see it at this point. We've generally organized this information into four main categories. This is how we're approaching the existing conditions document, which we should release some point in the next month or so. It's generally organized around history because it has very big implications on how things are the way they are today. The infrastructure and operations, what's in place today, what holds us back, how do we work today? Connectivity and demand, which is how do we connect with other services and what sort of destinations do we see along transit if we move forward? So we start with history, and I walked through this at the beginning, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but those, the development of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the development of the Reading Railroad really have a lot of implications on where we are today. And one good example of that is the power supplies for our system. You may hear about trains that get delayed because of signal issues or because of power issues. Some of that is within our control, some of that is not. And that's because of how we were developed as an organization and how we took over the rights for some of these railroads over the years. So the purple lines on the map are the old Reading Railroad side. And those are parts of the system that SEPTA fully owns and fully maintains. So we deal with the power supply, we deal with the power lines that power the trains directly. And if something happens, we send our crews out there to deal with it. The yellow lines are lines that we operate on, things like the Paoli-Thorndale line, the Trenton line, the Wilmington line, we operate on them, but Amtrak owns and maintains them. They develop the power supply. So we're in a way at their whim on those lines. And then the orange lines, like the Media line and the airport line, are a bit of a hybrid in between where we maintain them, but Amtrak supplies the power. So if something happens to Amtrak's power supply, we have to wait for them to fix it before we can go out there and fix our part of the problem. So that's just an example of how the history of our region and the history of how these systems were developed have implications on the way things are today. If we were to go out and improve something on the Paoli-Thorndale line, for example, it's something we have to do with Amtrak. We don't have full control over that. It also has some implications on right-of-way. As I mentioned, when we've gone through the peer review process, what you'll see, particularly when you compare us to places like Chicago and some of these cities out west, is that they share a lot of track right-of-way with freight companies. And that means that you have to wait for freight trains to clear, and they're generally longer and slower. So it takes up a lot of space, and it means you can't run trains as frequently as you might want to. So we have the benefit of having a lot of track that's completely freight separated, that we own it or Amtrak owns it, but generally it's just for passenger rail purposes. There's a lot more flexibility there, which really benefits us. And then ultimately there's level of service implications on that. We may have a great amount of double track space where we're not single tracking, which reduces the amount of frequency we can run. But there's a couple bottlenecks in our system that really limit the amount of service we can ultimately provide. And these are generally where multiple lines are coming together. So if you have 2 or 3 commuter rail lines coming together at one point, all those trains have to merge together. And that can cause some traffic jams for us and restrict the amount of service that we can provide. So those are the types of things we're looking at as we're talking about frequency improvements to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to provide that service. We're also looking at the travel patterns across our region. So this map's, every red dot on this map represents somebody who's using regional rail to commute into the city. The yellow dots are people using rail transit, which are the subways, light rail lines like the trolleys, the Norristown High Speed Line, the Market Frankford line, that sort of stuff. And then the green dots are bus riders who are taking the bus into Center City. And you can see a pretty interesting distribution of these people, where generally the red dots are in the suburbs using regional rail to commute into Center City. People in the city of Philadelphia are generally using the bus to get to Center City, even though about half of our stations are within the city of Philadelphia. And that's largely because of our limited frequency on regional rail lines in some parts of the system, as well as the lack of fare integration between the bus system and regional rail. So the bus trip might take you a little bit longer to get where you're going in Center City, but it's cheaper and it comes more frequently. So people are making that choice. When you look at the demographics of who's making those decisions, there's a clear disparity between regional rail and bus. So regional rail riders are generally white from households making $100,000 or more a year, and they have access to more than one vehicle. So in many ways, these people have different options. They have different choices, so to speak. Bus riders are generally the opposite. They don't have access to vehicles as easily. They may have access to one, but largely it's 0 or none. Their income levels are much lower. And you can see the three graphs on the right, regional rails on top and buses on the bottom. They're generally the inverse of each other. So regional rail is wealthier. Regional rail have access. Regional rail riders generally have access to more vehicles. And then most regional rail riders are generally white, non-Hispanic or Latino. And that's the opposite of bus. Rail transit falls somewhere in the middle of those two. But we know that our regional rail service is generally designed historically to accommodate those typical 9 to 5 commute patterns into the city in the morning and out of the city in the evening. And that's why we see demographics playing out the way we do. We're not serving every population that we could as well as we could at this point in time. I mentioned some of the differences between bus and regional rail and the city commute patterns. And if you look at part of the reason why that is because we have a lot of bus routes and rail transit routes that are effectively providing parallel services, where people that live in certain parts of our region might have the option of taking a bus or regional rail because we operate both in those corridors. But different frequencies and fare structures means that people are making choices, and that ultimately regional rail may not be the most competitive compared to some of these other sources. So what we're looking at as a part of this effort is how we can make sure that we're not providing parallel services, but we're providing complementary services, where bus routes may better feed into regional rail stations, but that might be a better trip for people to make a direct trip on regional rail as opposed to a parallel bus route or a parallel trolley route. So we're trying to find ways to make sure that those schedules are integrated and looking at our fares to see where those could be integrated as well. Even where those exist today, they're not as seamless as they could be. So there's a couple of examples on the screen now about where regional rail overlaps with major bus hubs or some of our rail transit network. And the North Philadelphia example is a really good one. We have a Broad Street Line station called North Philadelphia. We have a regional rail station called North Philadelphia and a regional rail station called North Broad, which are within 2 to 3 city blocks of each other. They generally overlap. The lines all cross each other right in that vicinity, but there's no real connection between the stations. They're treated as 3 completely different facilities in our front. That's just because they were built and maintained and operated for decades before SEPTA came into play by different companies. We've never fully integrated and unified these efforts together. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do right now. There's a few other examples on the screen. The Norristown Transportation Center is a good example of how we have been able to integrate some of those services. So in that facility, there's the Norristown High-Speed Line. There's a number of bus routes that serve that facility and the Norristown Transportation Center Regional Rail Station. Those are generally in very close proximity. There's connections between those. There's sidewalks and signage that make that clear, and some integration of the schedule. So that's ultimately what we're trying to strive towards, is making those sorts of connections easier for people to use, so that the trips that we're offering across our region are competitive regardless of which mode you may choose to use. And then ultimately making sure that the demand is there to justify these sorts of investments. So the dark red areas on this map, have an above average share of people that are commuting outside of the typical 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. commute pattern. So these are people that might be leaving for work at 4 a.m. or they might be leaving for work at 12 noon or 1 o'clock, but generally they're not commuting at those typical leave at 8 a.m. in the morning, come back at 5 p.m. in the evening type commute patterns, which were generally white collar workers in an office in Center City. And this is really helpful for us to see this distribution, because we know if we're talking about more consistent schedules throughout the day that are more frequent, but and provide a more predictable schedule throughout the course of the day, that's how we can serve these sorts of non-typical commute patterns across our region. And generally speaking, the research that we've done and some of our peers have done show that people making these sort of non-traditional commute patterns are more likely to be a person of color or a woman. And to provide a more equitable service for us, we know that we can't just cater to those typical white collar 9-to-5 commutes that we have. And then we're also looking at fare structures, which I have alluded to a couple of times already in this conversation, that the integration of our fare structure with our transit and bus networks is really a critical element for us to make sure that all of our services are as attractive as they can be. And then our vehicles have huge implications on the types of service we provide. So the picture on the screen shows what's referred to as a Silverliner 4. That represents about 2/3 of our rail fleet. These vehicles are very old. They were generally started running when Nixon was still our president. So they've seen better days, they've seen younger days. Generally speaking, SEPTA has the oldest rail fleet that's still operating in the country. It's something that means we have to spend more money maintaining trains. It means we have to spend more inspecting them. And it generally restricts the types of operational flexibilities that we have over time. Because some of our stations have high-level platforms, some of them have low-level platforms, it also means that we have spend a lot of time and effort and money staffing trains so that we can open and close trap doors. So you can see the assistant conductor or conductor here standing on what's referred to as a trap door, which is really just a cover for the stairwell. So they open that up when they're at low-level platforms and they close it when they're at high-level platforms. So we spend a lot of effort opening and closing those trap doors between every station. And it has a lot of implications on the cost of the service we provide and ultimately the speed that we can provide service as well. It takes a little bit longer to load or unload a train full of people when they have to go up and down a series of very steep steps. So making sure that our vehicles, as we move forward in our stations, are designed in a way that that's as easy as possible for people to walk on and off trains can help us speed up service as we move forward as well. And of course, naturally, as a part of these sort of conversations, there's inevitably conversations about where we should be serving, where we may be served in the past, and should return service to. So we're looking at those sort of extensions to make sure that they're evaluated as a part of these scenarios as we move forward as well. During the fall of 2021, we launched a really robust period of engagement. In late September and through October, we had an online survey with about 5,000 responses. We're really excited about the amount of feedback that we got. We also had a rolling pop-up event. You can see in that picture on the bottom, there's this little snack cart that we had that we rolled on and off trains across the region and made sure that we were getting people's attention at stations and talking to people face to face. We engaged about 2,000 people that way. And we would just frankly have an honest conversation about what they liked about regional rail, what they didn't like about regional rail, and how we could improve it to make it better and more useful for them. What we realized during that process and looking at the survey results is we weren't quite reaching a sample that was representative of our region as a whole. So we've established a way to have some focus groups across our region, conversations like this with different groups, to make sure that we're hearing from as many people and as many diverse perspectives as possible. Because what we've heard where we're doing that in-person pop-up events, we went to some parts of the region where regional rail ridership may be low, but we have really good service. And we heard from some people that regional rail is not, quote, for them. They don't think that it's meant for everyone in the region. They think it's really geared towards and meant for people that are making that 9-to-5 commute patterns, the white collar workers working in the center city. They think it's really geared towards them. And then it's not really a service that they should be using. And we heard that again and again and again from different groups. So that's why a lot of our focus as we move forward is making sure that we're hearing from a variety of perspectives and making sure that everyone has a seat at the table, everyone has a voice in where we're headed, and our services can provide a regional rail system that works for everyone. And what we've heard as we've gone through this process is that for those that don't use regional rail now, it's generally because it just doesn't come frequently enough or it costs too much. Those are the two biggest drivers. The third is that it doesn't go near where I live. That's something we expected to hear as well, but that frequency is a big driver of ridership, and that's something that rings true in just about everything that SEPTA focuses on right now. And then for those who do ride regional rail, we asked them what the most important thing for the future of regional rail was, and generally frequency of service was number one. It didn't surprise us there. But the second and thirds were a bit more surprising. they want to make sure that regional rail is integrated with bus service, that it's integrated with route transit as well. And that's something that we've conceptually been trying to push towards, but to see it come out organically in surveys, over 5,000 survey responses from people that ride transit across the region is really interesting. And that's why our focus is so much on the integration of these planning efforts that we have going on right now. So we're taking all of that information and we're organizing the general direction of where we're headed into a series of principles, goals, and objectives. And what we mean by principles is that ultimately there are core principles that apply to every scenario we're going to evaluate, that no matter what goal we're talking about or which scenario we're looking at, that these core principles are baked into it, that ultimately everything we do has to ensure that the systems and the services we provide are legible and easy for people to use, that people feel safe using regional rail, and that we're providing opportunities for people that might be traditionally marginalized to use regional rail in a more holistic way. And so the three goals that support that: goal one is redesigning regional rail to be a fundamental part of the lifestyle transit network. And what we mean by that is that it's frequent, easy to use, and it's integrated with those other transit modes. That's ultimately what we're trying to build towards here. The second goal is create a regional rail network that is welcoming and accommodating for everyone, making sure that it's affordable for people and increases the number of people who can access stations safely by walking or biking to those stations. They don't always need to drive a car and park at a station. And then the third and final goal, and probably one of the most important, is that people can rely on this service, that we're on time and that our system provides a level of reliability that you can trust, that SEPTA will get you where you need to go, when and where you need to get there. And that ultimately we're providing that frequent service where that demand justifies it and where we can provide it over time. So what's next besides finishing up some of this existing conditions information? We're going to release what we're referring to as a state of the system report, which will summarize the existing conditions and some of the opportunities as we see it today. We'll collect some additional feedback from communities that weren't necessarily reached by the surveys, have some more conversations like this, and develop a series of scenarios based on what we hear from these conversations. So with that, I don't know if we want to, I don't think we want to get into questions or comments. I think we're going to break out into some breakout rooms right now. So I'll stop sharing at this point, but happy to answer any questions as time allows later on.
Ryan, thank you so much. I think we have time. If anyone has a question that you really want to pose right now, we can do that. Or if not, we can go into breakouts. And Jacqui's asking me a question around some polls that we have as well. So we have questions for you if you have questions for us. So let's make sure we get in one of those polls before we go into our breakout rooms. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to launch a poll about regional rail use. That just helps us understand, before we go into our breakouts, a little bit more about before COVID, how often were you riding SEPTA during, and then kind of during COVID, kind of what your use has looked like. So I'm going to launch that really quickly. If we can take just a moment, we'll respond to this. So hopefully that looks coming up on your screen. Seeing some nods, always good. I see responses going up. We'll give it just a minute more. Make sure we can all share out. All right, I'm going to close it in just a moment. Final time to get your answers in. I'm going to end that poll. Thank you. We will, of course, share these results out with everybody. And you can do that now, so we can just all kind of see what this kind of usage looks like. But of course, we'll include that in our follow-up materials here. So we have some folks that have, been on regional rail before COVID a few times a week. We see a lot of folks who have been on the rail a few times a year, some who've never. So make sure that we're kind of welcoming in our breakouts to all coming in with different experiences here. And then we see some trends here as well for during COVID. Let me stop sharing. We have a couple more polls that we'll do after we get through our breakouts, but I want to make sure that we have time to hear from you. So let me just tee up the instructions for those breakout rooms so that we all kind of have a good sense of of where we're headed. So you've been assigned to a breakout room according to your registration and the primary county identification you listed. So there's going to be about like 5 to 8 folks in each room with a facilitator from either Bucks-Mont Collaborative, the partnership TMA of Montgomery County, TMA Bucks, or SEPTA. So thank you to those facilitators. And while of course the conversation is open, we do have several questions to help the SEPTA Forward team understand, your regional rail challenges, the successes that you've seen, and then, specific geographic and rail needs. So the facilitator will be taking notes, and these will be shared out in our follow-up materials so that you can continue to add any reflections or questions after the session. So we'll keep that kind of, that Padlet, which is what we use, it's an online note-taking system, open so that you can continue to add it. We'll probably give right now, let's see, look about 15 or so minutes in those breakout rooms. So we'll have time to connect. And then of course we can just continue from there with the Padlet. So I'm going to open up those rooms. You should be moved automatically into them. If not, stay with me and I'll get you to your room. Okay. I'm going to open up those rooms now. Does it work? So there was a question that was posed in the chat before we went into breakouts and I missed it. And so I wanted to just kind of call that out. I'm not sure if it was addressed in the breakouts, but Kathy had asked, and I will look to the SEPTA team to respond. Have any of the scenarios being explored by SEPTA pertain to improving transportation options for getting around in Bucks and in Montgomery County? So looking at that geographic.
It's a good question, Kathy. I think, regional rail the master plan effort hasn't developed the scenarios yet, so we're not quite at that point. But what I'll say is that we're working in tandem with our Bus Revolution project, which is looking at bus services across our region as a whole to make sure that they're serving everyone's needs right now. And as a part of that, those scenarios are going to really address connections in and around the Montgomery and Bucks counties. So we can send and drop it in the chat a link to that project website, which has some opportunities to sign up and get engaged and get some updates as we move forward in that process. It'll probably be mid to late April that we'll release a set of scenarios that everyone can provide some feedback on that'll help to address that question.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm seeing, oh, Jenna already put it in. So good. Jenna, she put in the Bus Revolution link. Wonderful. Any other final questions? I know we have 1 minute. Anything that's just, we've got to get it out before we wrap up today. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today. It's so good to spend time just reimagining regional rail. Thank you to the partnership TMA of Montgomery County and to TMA Bucks for co-hosting this discussion. Thank you to the SEPTA Forward team for your time and your leadership on this work. And we know there's a lot of work happening behind the scenes to get us to this point where we're really talking about transforming our region's transportation system. So thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll be sending out the materials to you later on today. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristyn.
Thanks.
Thank you.